All right, so for my book compare, I'm doing a comparison of Peyton Jones's Church Plantology with Mark Dever's The Church, the Gospel Made Visible. So I wanted to raise a few points that I identified of differences between the two works. First, I wanted to talk about multiplication of other leaders to be sent out, start other churches, continue the work of planting, multiplication, reproduction. I would say this is a theme that is prevalent throughout Jones's work and is a little more lacking in Dever's work. I think partly because that's not totally the goal of Dever's work as much as it is establishing the marks of a true church. But I do think it was something that I wanted to highlight, particularly because of what a strong theme it is in Jones' work. So I wanted to read a few quotes from Jones' work where he says the first lesson that Paul taught us is that it's not about your church plant, but it's about raising others up, equipping them, and allowing them to deploy outward from whatever church you plant. It's about multiplying yourself, creating disciples who learn from you, both your mistakes and successes, and surpass what you've done. So I actually talked a little bit about this in my Acts learning guide, that this was something I hadn't even really picked up on in the book of Acts until reading Jones's work of how intentional Paul was about raising up other leaders. And you kind of see this near the end of the book of Acts in Acts 20, where it lists off a number of co-workers that were traveling with him from all over the region of Europe and Asia. And so this is something that is core to Jones's work as a church planter, is something that he says you should have an eye to throughout your ministry from the very get-go, and not so much just focusing on your church plant, but thinking about how can you continue to grow the kingdom of God by raising up other leaders. And this is something, although Dever talks about having a plurality of elders, a team leading the church, he doesn't touch too much outside of encouraging a culture of discipleship generally, without many tactics of how to do that. He doesn't really touch on how would you identify new leaders, raise up new leaders, send people out. So that was the first thing I wanted to talk through. Secondly, I would say is the centrality of the word and preaching as a mark of the church. This is something that Dever talks about a good bit in his work. And although Jones touches on it, he says in chapter 1, the growth of the word is clearly coextensive with the growth of the church. Luke uses the verb to grow in connection with the word. So he touches on it, but he doesn't really expound further upon the centrality of preaching for the church. He does talk a little bit about his approach and what he's found to be effective in preaching, and it being more of kind of a discussion-based approach, where maybe he'll talk for shorter periods of time and allow the congregation to respond, break out into groups, discuss what had been taught. So he has a little bit more of an innovative approach, I would say, to the task of preaching, whereas Dever has a more traditional approach of someone standing up before the congregation, a single person preaching the word of God and standing in the position of God. So Dever says that Christians gather in congregations to hear one who stands in the place of God by giving his word to his people. Through preaching, Christians come to know and understand God and his word. I would line up most with Dever on this one. I think there's real value in standing before the people of God, declaring the word of God, thus saith the Lord, that it is used mightily by God to convict, to teach, and to really help conform the people of God to the image of Christ. So that's the next point I wanted to call out. And I would say I align most with Dever from his perspective on that. And then I want to talk about missionary ecclesiology. Again, this is another aspect that's central to Jones' work in church plantology. And he says, I think, a convicting question of how many leaders of large churches can you think of who are making disciples and evangelizing their community outside of the pulpit? So coming off of that centrality of the word, I think Dever's absolutely right that it's critical and important to have the word be central to all of your regular gatherings and meetings as a church. But there's also more to the church than just the preaching on a Sunday, but also how are we walking out and living on mission day by day in our lives. And I think Jones does a really good job of talking about this. He has a couple of chapters dedicated to rediscovering church as mission. And he says that church planners need to do 4 things to really develop this skill. Again, he says, 1, we've got to understand the gospel. We've got to 2, gain an understanding of God's heart for others. 3, we have to learn to contextualize the gospel in conversation. 4, we have to recognize opportunities for stepping out in faith and risking for the sake of lost people. And then he closes some of these chapters with a quote from Charles Spurgeon saying, do something, do something, do something, and encourages, invite someone to dinner, pray for someone, walk through your neighborhood, praying for others, have a neighborhood cookout, invite people over. Just do something to step out in faith and begin reaching your community. So although this is something that Dever says is important as a church, we need to be the gospel made visible. And he talks about the proper ends for a local congregation being the worship of God, the edification of the church, and the evangelization of the world. So he recognizes the importance, but he doesn't give much further thought to how we go about doing that as a church, whereas I think Jones gives some really helpful tactics to do that and encouragement for how we should go about that. Marks of a church. So this is I think one of the biggest helps for me personally was going through Dever's The Church and thinking about how do you establish a robust ecclesiology as a church planner going into the work of planting. How do you have a solid membership process? How do you clearly define membership for your church? What marks out the church as a distinct entity from the world? And so he talks about the central marks of preaching, and then the ordinances of the church being the Lord's Supper and baptism. And he speaks a lot to the mode of baptism and to the proper age and recipients of baptism. And I think it's something that's really helpful. He gave a lot of good resources for Baptist believers and Baptist ecclesiology to really work out the definition and mode and way of baptism that I'm excited to look into, and I think is very important for future church planners to define, understand, and have at the forefront of their minds as they're going to go plant, and not just have it as an afterthought. And that's where, as I read through Jones's work, it kind of seemed more like that. He didn't talk about any marks of what. How you can identify the church, what makes the church the church. So I think his work was lacking in talking about any of those marks, talking about membership, talking about church discipline, and how you enact that from the start of your church. And I think this is something where in our class we talked about how a lot of times we can look at evangelization and missional ecclesiology as one thing, and then having clear marks of the church and a robust ecclesiology of what constitutes the church at odds with one another, when really the two of those should be able to be united and held together. And I think when we do that, we get to really healthy churches that we can plant. So the last thing I wanted to touch on was Jones's exploration of APEST giftings. And I would say this is something that was not really talked about, was not, again, the goal of Dever's work. He talks about the offices of elders and deacons and talks about the importance of being able to teach as an elder. and that the way of that teaching seems to be just around how you would preach the word on a Sunday morning in regular gatherings, whereas Jones looks at the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher giftings and talks through how each of those work themselves out for elders as they're teaching. And so how each one of those gifts is prevalent in the teaching of different elders, and how each one is important and necessary for the church to grow to full maturity. Although I don't know if I would use the exact terms of apostle or prophet, I do think that having these giftings as a part of a church planning team, and even for an established church in a plurality of elders, is highly valuable. And I do think that there's been almost an overemphasis in kind of the academic theological way of teaching the Word of God. And it's been to the detriment, or at least where we haven't celebrated the gifts of those who are more pioneering, those who have a passion for evangelism. And I think we do need to recover having all of those giftings be central to the leadership of the church and to the congregation, to be able to see really healthy churches planted. So those were the 5 things that I wanted to highlight. I'm thankful for both of these books. I think they're going to serve me well in helping for me to be a future church planner and pastor.